when a construction crew discovered human remains buried in a collapsed tobacco barn outside Lumberton, North Carolina in February 2024. They had no idea they'd just solved a cold case from 2008. The victim was Jane, a 20-year-old nursing student who vanished with her 8-month-old daughter Olivia from the Robeson County Harvest Festival on October 11, 2008. What investigators uncovered about her final hours was more disturbing than anyone could imagine. This cold case remained unsolved for 16 years, while Jane disappeared without a trace from a crowded carnival. She'd been last seen alive around 8:30 that Saturday evening, pushing Olivia's stroller past carnival games, while hundreds of witnesses somehow saw nothing useful. Her cell phone pinged off a tower on Highway 301 just before 9, then went silent forever. Lumberton sits in southeastern North Carolina, roughly 30 miles from the South Carolina border, where pine forests stretch between small communities connected by dark, 2-lane highways. Jane had been a dedicated student at Robeson Community College, balancing anatomy classes with motherhood after Olivia's father abandoned them. She lived with her grandmother Patricia on Godwin Avenue, working evening shifts at Waffle House to pay for textbooks and baby formula. That October evening started normally. Jane dressed Olivia in a pink onesie with pumpkins on it, excited to take her daughter to experience carnival lights, even though the baby was too young to remember. Patricia gave her $40 and made her promise to be home by 10 for Monday's exam. Jane kissed her grandmother's cheek and left, her backpack containing diapers, bottles, and a cell phone running low on prepaid minutes. The Robeson County Harvest Festival occupied 20 acres behind the agricultural center off Highway 301, drawing families from surrounding counties. The Carnival Company operated out of Tennessee, employing traveling workers who'd been moving from county to county. Jane texted her friend Kayla around 7, saying Olivia loved watching the carousel. That text was the last communication anyone received from her. By 11, when Jane hadn't returned, Patricia started calling everyone. Kayla hadn't seen Jane since the cotton candy stand. Jane's cousin Marcus spotted her walking toward the fairgrounds back around 8. When Patricia drove to the festival, she found the gates locked and the midway dark, except for security lights casting shadows across abandoned game booths. The missing person report, filed at 2 in the morning on October 12, 2008, triggered immediate response because an infant's life hung in the balance. Deputies searched the festival grounds at first light, while carnival workers were questioned. Jane's barely functional 1998 Honda Civic sat where she'd parked it. Her purse was locked inside with her wallet, containing ID and $17. Only her cell phone and diaper bag were missing. Search dogs tracked Jane's scent from carnival games to a dirt access road behind the agricultural center, but the trail vanished at pavement. Robeson County had a troubling history. Between 2017 and 2019, several women vanished from Highway 301 areas, their bodies discovered months later. But in 2008, that pattern hadn't emerged yet. As dawn broke over Lumberton that Sunday morning, Patricia stood in empty festival grounds, clutching Olivia's pink blanket found near the Ferris wheel. The granddaughter she'd raised was gone, along with the baby who represented their family's hope. What nobody knew was that answers lay buried 3 miles away in a location that would remain undisturbed for 16 years. What happened between 8:30 when Jane was seen walking and 9 when her phone went silent? Dawn broke over Robeson County on Sunday, October 12, 2008, with temperatures climbing toward 70 degrees as volunteers gathered where Jane's abandoned Honda Civic sat like a silent witness. Sheriff Thomas Bennett had coordinated missing person searches before, but never one where a helpless infant's life hung in the balance. By 6 in the morning, more than 200 volunteers assembled, their faces reflecting urgent determination. Patricia stood near the command tent deputies had erected overnight, clutching a photograph of Jane holding Olivia taken 3 days earlier. She hadn't slept, spending dark hours calling everyone who might know something. The calls yielded nothing except growing dread that something terrible had happened between Carnival games and the moment Jane's phone went silent. The missing person investigation hit full stride as bloodhounds from Cumberland County arrived. The dogs were given Jane's pillowcase to establish her scent before being led to the last confirmed location near game booths. The animals immediately picked up the trail, noses pressed to dirt as they followed an invisible path from Carnival games toward the back of the property, past the tilt-a-whirl where Olivia's blanket had been discovered, toward a service road used by maintenance vehicles. Then the trail vanished at Highway 301, just like so many other cases where scent disappeared at pavement. The lead handler, Curtis, a veteran with 15 years of search and rescue experience, explained to Sheriff Bennett that vehicle exhaust, overnight dew, and time could all disrupt scent trails. But the fact that dogs tracked Jane away from her parked car toward the highway suggested something investigators didn't want to acknowledge. Someone had taken her. Kayla arrived around 7:30 with printouts of text messages exchanged with Jane. She explained to Detective Lisa Morgan that Jane had seemed completely normal, excited about taking Olivia to see Carnival lights, even though money was tight. Their last face-to-face conversation near the cotton candy stand around 7 had been brief but unremarkable. Kayla remembered Jane saying she needed to feed Olivia soon and would probably head home within the hour. What investigators found significant was the timeline gap between Kayla's 7 o'clock encounter and when Jane's cousin Marcus spotted her walking toward the fairgrounds back around 8:30. That missing 90 minutes represented a crucial period where Jane's movements remained unaccounted for. Festival security cameras were limited to the main entrance and ticket booth, leaving the majority of 20-acre grounds unmonitored. The Carnival workers became primary investigative focus. The Tennessee-based company employed roughly 35 people for the Robeson County event. Sheriff Bennett and deputies interviewed each worker methodically, documenting names, addresses, criminal backgrounds, and exact whereabouts during critical Saturday evening hours when Jane vanished without a trace. Most Carnival employees had solid alibis verified by multiple witnesses, but 2 workers immediately raised red flags. A maintenance worker named Dale, who operated the Gravitron, had left town early Sunday morning before Jane's disappearance became widely known. More concerning was local hire Brandon, who'd been working security near back access roads and hadn't reported for his Sunday morning shift. By late afternoon, the unsolved mystery seemed impossible to crack without new leads. Search teams had combed through pine forests along Highway 301, checked every abandoned building within 10 miles, and searched drainage ditches and culverts. Local television stations broadcast Jane's photograph every hour, asking anyone who'd attended the festival to call the tip line. As darkness fell, Patricia returned to her empty house, where Jane's anatomy textbook still lay open, and Olivia's crib waited silent. The question haunting everyone was simultaneously obvious and terrifying. If something had happened to Jane, where was her baby? What nobody knew was that answers lay buried 3 miles away in a location that wouldn't be discovered for 16 years. The first promising lead came Monday afternoon when truck driver Earl contacted the Robeson County Sheriff's Office, claiming he'd seen a young woman matching Jane's description hitchhiking along Highway 301 around 9:30 Saturday night. Earl said the woman was carrying something that looked like a baby car seat and had been standing near the shoulder about 3 miles south of the agricultural center. He hadn't stopped due to company policy against picking up hitchhikers, but the image stuck with him all weekend. Detective Morgan drove to meet Earl at a truck stop off Interstate 95, bringing photographs and detailed questions about what he'd witnessed. Earl seemed certain at first, describing a young woman in jeans and a dark jacket standing where streetlights were sparse and pine forests pressed close to the road. But when Morgan pressed for specific details about the woman's appearance, Earl's confidence began to waver. Maybe the jacket had been lighter, Maybe she'd been taller or shorter. The certainty that seemed so solid over the phone crumbled under questioning. What detectives working this cold case found frustrating was how unreliable eyewitness testimony became once people knew they were potentially the last person to see a missing woman alive. Earl genuinely wanted to help, but his memory had been contaminated by seeing Jane's photograph on television. By the time Morgan finished the interview, she couldn't be certain whether Earl had actually seen Jane or had simply convinced himself he'd seen someone matching her description. Tuesday brought another witness who complicated the missing person investigation rather than clarifying it. A woman named Doris, who'd been working the funnel cake booth, came forward claiming she'd seen Jane engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with a carnival worker behind the games area around 8:15 Saturday evening. Doris remembered it specifically because Jane had seemed upset, which struck her as unusual for someone attending a family-friendly event with a baby. Sheriff Bennett interviewed Doris extensively, trying to extract details about the carnival worker she'd supposedly seen arguing with Jane. Was it a man or woman? How tall? What were they wearing? But Doris's memory proved frustratingly vague. The lighting behind the games area had been poor, and she'd only caught glimpses while serving customers. All she could say with certainty was that Jane had appeared distressed, and there had definitely been another person present. The potential confrontation angle led investigators to re-interview every carnival worker present Saturday evening. They questioned ride operators about their interactions with festival attendees, checked employment records for anyone with violence history, and asked pointed questions about whereabouts during critical hours when Jane vanished without a trace. The carnival company's owner cooperated fully, providing personnel files and contact information for employees who'd already left North Carolina. By Wednesday, the unsolved mystery had generated dozens of tips that consumed investigative resources while producing no concrete evidence. Someone reported seeing a young woman with a baby getting into a dark sedan. Someone else claimed they'd heard a baby crying from inside a storage trailer. A psychic from Fayetteville called, insisting she'd had a vision of Jane near water, sending search teams to check every pond and drainage ditch within 15 miles. As the first week ended without breakthrough in the missing person case, media attention intensified. National news outlets picked up the story of the nursing student who'd vanished with her baby from a county carnival. The community's initial hope began transforming into something darker. The growing realization that Jane and Olivia might never be found. What nobody knew was that both answers and evidence were buried just 3 miles from where hundreds of searchers were looking. The breakthrough in the missing person case came on Thursday afternoon, October 16th, when Detective Morgan finally tracked down Dale, the carnival maintenance worker who'd left town Sunday morning claiming a family emergency. Tennessee authorities located him at a motel outside Nashville, and what started as a routine interview quickly became something far more significant. Dale admitted he'd lied about the emergency because he had outstanding warrants for unpaid traffic violations and didn't want North Carolina police running his information. But Dale provided investigators with crucial information that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. He remembered seeing Jane near the back service road around 8:30 Saturday evening, and she hadn't been alone. According to Dale, Jane had been talking with another carnival worker named Chris, a ride operator who'd been hired just 2 weeks before the Robeson County Festival. Dale described Chris as being in his late 20s, quiet, someone who kept to himself during setup and teardown. Sheriff Bennett immediately pulled Chris's employment file from the carnival company's records. The file was disturbingly thin. Chris had provided a Tennessee driver's license, a disconnected phone number, and an address that turned out to be a self-storage facility in Memphis. The carnival company's owner admitted his background check process had been minimal, focused more on whether workers showed up on time than verifying credentials. What made detectives working this cold case increasingly concerned was that Chris had also left town early Sunday morning, telling his supervisor he needed to get to the next scheduled festival in South Carolina. But when investigators contacted the South Carolina venue, they learned Chris had never shown up for work. He'd simply disappeared, just like Jane and Olivia, within hours of the festival closing. The unsolved mystery suddenly had a name and a face, even if that face was only captured in a grainy employee ID photograph showing a man with dark hair, average build, and features so unremarkable he could blend into any crowd. Bennett issued a BOLO alert across multiple states. The Tennessee driver's license number came back as fraudulent, belonging to someone who'd reported it stolen 3 years earlier. By Friday, investigators had re-interviewed every Carnival worker who'd interacted with Chris during the 2 weeks he'd been employed. The picture that emerged was troubling. Chris had been competent at his job, but avoided socializing with other workers. He'd claimed to have experience with traveling carnivals, but couldn't answer basic questions about previous employers. Several workers remembered him watching families with children during setup, which at the time had seemed like innocent observation, but now took on sinister tone. Most significantly, a teenage worker named Ashley remembered Chris asking questions about the festival's security procedures and camera placements. He'd wanted to know which areas were monitored and where blind spots were located. Ashley had thought he was worried about theft from game booths, but now investigators realized he might have been planning something far worse. A records check revealed something chilling that expanded this cold case beyond Robeson County. Over the previous 3 years, at least 4 other women had vanished from county festivals and agricultural fairs across the Southeast, all during events where traveling carnival companies had been operating. The women ranged in age from 19 to 32, and none of them had ever been found. Had they identified their suspect too late? Winter arrived early in Robeson County during November 2008, bringing freezing rain that turned dirt roads to mud and made outdoor searches nearly impossible. 6 weeks had passed since Jane and Olivia vanished from the Harvest Festival, and despite identifying Chris as their primary suspect, investigators had found no trace of him. The carnival worker who'd used a fake identity had disappeared as completely as his victims. Sheriff Bennett sat in his office on a gray December morning, staring at case files that had grown to fill 4 boxes, but contained frustratingly little concrete evidence. The FBI had officially classified Jane's disappearance as a suspected abduction and possible homicide. Pattern recognition suggested they were dealing with a serial predator, but patterns didn't lead to arrests without evidence and witnesses. Patricia had spent Thanksgiving alone in her house on Godwin Avenue, unable to face relatives who didn't know what to say about her missing granddaughter and great-granddaughter. Jane's anatomy textbook still lay open on the kitchen table. Olivia's crib remained made up with sheets that would never be used. The house had become a museum of interrupted lives. By January 2009, the missing person investigation had consumed every available resource without producing the breakthrough investigators desperately needed. Tennessee authorities had tracked Chris's fraudulent driver's license to a theft ring operating out of Memphis, but the stolen identity trail went cold there. Whoever Chris really was, he'd been careful about covering his tracks long before arriving in North Carolina. Detective Morgan spent months interviewing carnival workers across the Southeast, documenting the transient workforce that moved from festival to festival with minimal oversight or background checks. What she discovered was disturbing. An entire shadow economy existed where workers could move between states using cash payments and fake credentials, making them nearly impossible to track. What detectives working this cold case didn't know was that they'd actually driven past the burial site multiple times during those frantic early weeks of searching. The collapsed tobacco barn where Jane's remains lay hidden sat just 3 miles from the agricultural center, surrounded by pine forest, thick enough to conceal it from the road. Patricia requested that the reward fund be increased to $25,000, contributing her own savings despite her limited income. Local businesses donated additional money. Churches held fundraisers, and the community rallied around the case, even as months stretched into a year without answers. By October 2009, exactly 1 year after Jane's disappearance, Sheriff Bennett held a press conference asking anyone with information about Chris to contact authorities. But the anniversary passed without new leads, and investigators began confronting the possibility that Jane and Olivia might never be found. What nobody knew was that Chris had already moved on to his next hunting ground, working at carnivals under a different fake identity, while the investigation churned through dead ends. 16 years is a long time to carry grief without answers. Patricia passed away in August 2023 at the age of 83, never knowing what happened to her granddaughter and great-granddaughter, who'd vanished from the Harvest Festival that October evening in 2008. She'd spent the last years of her life in the same house on Godwin Avenue, surrounded by photographs of Jane holding Olivia. The cold case that haunted Robeson County for over a decade had transformed from an active investigation into local legend by 2015. New residents moving to Lumberton heard the story during their first weeks in town. Sheriff Bennett had retired in 2012, replaced by Sheriff Karen Mitchell, who inherited case files that had grown to fill an entire storage room but contained no answers. What detectives working this unsolved mystery found most frustrating was how close they'd come to identifying their suspect, only to watch him vanish just as completely as his victims. Chris, the carnival worker with the fake Tennessee driver's license, had never been found, despite nationwide alerts and FBI involvement. The FBI's investigation into similar disappearances at Southeast carnivals had revealed a disturbing pattern, but produced no arrests. Between 2005 and 2010, 7 women had vanished from county festivals and agricultural fairs, where traveling carnival companies were operating. None of those women had ever been found. By 2018, Jane's missing person case had been featured on multiple true crime podcasts and television programs. Amateur investigators traveled to Lumberton each October, walking the grounds of the agricultural center and theorizing about what might have happened that night. The most popular theory suggested Chris had abducted both Jane and Olivia, killing them and disposing of their bodies in a remote location that might never be discovered. Kayla, Jane's best friend, who'd been one of the last people to see her alive, still lived in Robeson County and thought about that October evening constantly. She'd married, had children of her own, and built a life that moved forward even as part of her remained frozen at that moment near the cotton candy stand. The reward fund had grown to $38,000 through compound interest and occasional donations. But reward money meant nothing without someone willing to provide information that could crack the investigation open. Sheriff Mitchell had reopened the case in 2020, using new forensic techniques to re-examine the limited evidence collected in 2008, but the results yielded nothing new. What nobody knew yet was that time and weather were working in investigators' favor, even as hope faded. The tobacco barn's roof had been slowly deteriorating since the 1990s. By February 2024, the structure had become so unstable that the property owner decided to demolish it rather than risk liability. The construction crew that arrived had no idea they were about to solve a cold case that had consumed Robeson County for 16 years. The excavator's bucket scraped against something that wasn't wood or dirt on a cold February morning in 2024, producing a sound that made construction foreman Marcus Williams stop the machine immediately. His crew had been hired to demolish an abandoned tobacco barn 3 miles outside Lumberton on Old Wire Road. The structure was dangerous, its roof partially collapsed, and walls leaning at angles that threatened collapse. Williams climbed down from the excavator, his boots crunching through frost-covered weeds as he approached the exposed section. What he'd struck wasn't a support beam or old farming equipment. Partially exposed in the disturbed earth beneath the collapsed roof section was fabric, badly deteriorated, but still recognizable as clothing. And beneath that fabric, something that made Williams's stomach drop, the unmistakable curve of human bone. The Robeson County Sheriff's Office received the call at 9:45. Deputy Chen arrived within 20 minutes and immediately recognized that they were looking at potential human remains. She secured the area with crime scene tape, called for backup, and contacted Sheriff Karen Mitchell, who understood the significance immediately. This cold case that had haunted the county for 16 years might finally have answers. The forensic team from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation arrived by early afternoon, bringing ground-penetrating radar equipment and forensic anthropologists. What they discovered over the next 6 hours would confirm everyone's worst fears, while simultaneously providing the breakthrough investigators had needed. Buried beneath approximately 3 feet of dirt and debris were skeletal remains of 2 individuals, 1 adult and 1 infant. The adult remains were positioned in a way that suggested the victim had been trying to protect something at the moment of death. The infant remains were found directly beneath, cradled in what would have been the adult's arms. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell explained that the positioning suggested the adult victim's final conscious act had been attempting to shield the baby. Initial examination revealed additional evidence that transformed this from a missing person case into a homicide investigation. The adult skull showed clear signs of blunt force trauma, a fracture pattern consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. Fragments of what appeared to be a tire iron were found near the remains, heavily corroded, but still identifiable. More significantly, partially preserved fabric samples included what looked like the remains of a pink infant outfit and a diaper bag. What made the discovery particularly haunting was the location. The tobacco barn sat just off Old Wire Road, less than 3 miles from the agricultural center where the Harvest Festival had taken place in October 2008. During those initial frantic weeks of searching, patrol cars had driven past this property multiple times. DNA samples were collected and sent to the state crime lab. After 16 years of dead ends and frustration, this unsolved mystery was about to crack wide open. The call from the North Carolina State Crime Lab came on March 5, 2024, 3 weeks after the remains had been discovered. Sheriff Karen Mitchell answered expecting routine preliminary results, but what forensic specialist Dr. Rebecca Chen explained would transform this cold case into a prosecution-ready investigation with physical evidence that finally gave Jane and Olivia their voices back after 16 years of silence. DNA analysis had definitively confirmed what investigators already suspected. The adult remains belonged to Jane, matched through mitochondrial DNA extracted from her deceased grandmother, Patricia's medical records. The infant remains were Olivia, confirmed through DNA comparison with Jane's profile. After 16 years of uncertainty, Patricia's family finally had confirmation. But what made this cold case breakthrough truly significant was what else forensic analysis revealed. The tire iron found near the remains had been cleaned, but not well enough to remove all biological evidence. Advanced DNA extraction techniques recovered minute traces of blood from microscopic crevices in the corroded metal, blood that matched Jane's DNA profile. More importantly, investigators discovered his own DNA preserved on the weapon's handle, where his sweat had mixed with rust and created a protective barrier that survived 16 years of burial. Dr. Chen explained that the DNA profile recovered from the tire iron was male, definitively ruling out any theory that Jane's death had been accidental. This was murder, committed by someone strong enough to wield a tire iron with lethal force. The profile was immediately entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. The forensic evidence revealed additional disturbing details about Jane's final moments. Autopsy results showed that Jane had sustained multiple blunt force trauma injuries to her skull. The pattern of injuries indicated she'd been facing her attacker when the assault began, possibly while trying to protect Olivia, who'd been in her arms. What detectives discovered most heartbreaking was evidence that Jane had survived the initial attack long enough to attempt protecting Olivia, even as she was dying. The positioning of the remains, with Jane's body curled protectively around her infant daughter, suggested her last conscious act had been shielding the baby. The missing person case was officially reclassified as a double homicide on March 6, 2024. Sheriff Mitchell held a press conference announcing the discovery and confirming that investigators had recovered DNA evidence that could lead to an arrest. The CODIS search results came back on March 8, 2024. The DNA profile from the tire iron matched a man named Christopher Dalton, currently incarcerated in a Georgia state prison, serving time for aggravated assault. Investigators had finally identified Chris, the mysterious Carnival worker who'd vanished from Robeson County the same night as Jane and Olivia. The breakthrough investigators had needed for 16 years was finally within reach. Sheriff Karen Mitchell and Detective Morgan arrived at Georgia State Prison in Reidsville on March 15, 2024, carrying case files that documented 16 years of investigation. Christopher Dalton, now 43 years old, sat across from them in the interview room with calculated composure. He'd been expecting this conversation ever since his DNA profile hit in CODIS. Mitchell opened a folder containing photographs of the crime scene, watching Dalton's face carefully as she laid out images of the collapsed barn, the excavation site, and finally the tire iron. Dalton's expression remained neutral, almost bored, as if he were being shown pictures of someone else's crimes. Detective Morgan began with background questions, establishing Dalton's work history with traveling Carnival companies between 2005 and 2015. Dalton admitted to working under multiple aliases, claiming he'd been avoiding child support obligations. He remembered working the Robeson County Harvest Festival in October 2008 and acknowledged that he'd left town Sunday morning without giving proper notice. What made detectives confident they had their killer was how Christopher Dalton's story began changing the moment Mitchell mentioned DNA evidence. Initially, Dalton claimed he'd never interacted with festival attendees beyond standard duties. But when confronted with Dale's statement about seeing him talking with Jane near the service road, Dalton's memory suddenly improved. Mitchell let Dalton maintain that story before introducing the forensic evidence that would dismantle his lies. The DNA profile wasn't just touch DNA that could be explained away. It was sweat mixed with Jane's blood, preserved in microscopic crevices where 16 years of burial had protected it. That combination could only exist if Dalton had been gripping the tire iron with enough force to sweat while using it to strike Jane repeatedly. The missing person case that had remained unsolved for 16 years suddenly had overwhelming physical evidence. His demeanor shifted from calculated indifference to defensive aggression as he demanded to speak with an attorney. But before ending the interview, Mitchell asked one more question. Where was Olivia during the attack? Dalton refused to answer, but his expression revealed something Mitchell had suspected all along. This wasn't a crime of passion. Christopher Dalton had targeted Jane specifically, lured her away from the crowded festival to an isolated location, and murdered both her and Olivia with enough premeditation to have a burial site already prepared. What troubled both investigators was the realization that Jane and Olivia might not be Dalton's only victims. The FBI had identified 7 women who'd vanished from Southeast carnivals between 2005 and 2010. Would Christopher Dalton reveal what happened to those other missing women? Christopher Dalton was extradited from Georgia to North Carolina on April 7, 2024, arriving at the Robeson County Detention Center in shackles and an orange jumpsuit. Sheriff Karen Mitchell watched through one-way glass as deputies processed him into the system. The cold case team had finally captured their suspect, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The formal charges read like a nightmare catalog of violence. 2 counts of first-degree murder for Jane and Olivia, 2 counts of kidnapping, felony murder, and concealment of death. North Carolina prosecutors decided against pursuing the death penalty after consulting with Patricia's surviving family members. Instead, they would seek consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, ensuring Dalton would spend every remaining day of his life in prison. What made this missing person case particularly strong for prosecution was the combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Dalton's own documented pattern of deception. The DNA recovered from the tire iron was conclusive proof that he'd been present during Jane's murder and had wielded the weapon used to kill her. The burial location 3 miles from the festival grounds demonstrated premeditation, someone who'd scouted the area and prepared a grave before committing the crime. Defense attorney Michael Warren, a public defender with 20 years of experience handling capital cases, met with Dalton for the first time on April 5th. The meeting lasted 4 hours and ended with Warren understanding that his client had no viable defense strategy. The forensic evidence was bulletproof, the witness testimony was credible, and Dalton's documented history of using fake identities demonstrated exactly the kind of predatory behavior that juries found impossible to forgive. Detectives working this cold case spent April re-interviewing witnesses from 2008, many of whom had moved away from Robeson County but were willing to return for trial testimony. Kayla, Jane's best friend, who'd been one of the last people to see her alive, flew back from Virginia, where she now worked as a teacher. Dale, the Carnival maintenance worker, whose statement had first identified Dalton as a suspect, agreed to testify despite concerns about his own legal exposure. By May 2024, the unsolved mystery that had consumed Robeson County for 16 years was preparing for its moment in court. The trial was scheduled for August in the Robeson County Superior Court, with Judge Patricia Anderson presiding over what was expected to be a 3-week proceeding that would attract national media attention. What nobody knew yet was whether Christopher Dalton would actually go to trial or whether the overwhelming evidence would force him to accept a plea agreement. Defense attorney Warren had requested a meeting with prosecutors to discuss potential resolution of the charges, suggesting that Dalton might be willing to provide information about other victims in exchange for a more lenient sentence. Should they accept a plea agreement that might bring closure to other families who'd spent years wondering what happened to their missing daughters, sisters, and mothers? Or should they pursue maximum punishment regardless of what other secrets he might reveal? The negotiation meeting took place on June 12, 2024, in a secure conference room at the Robeson County District Attorney's Office. Christopher Dalton sat handcuffed between his defense attorney Michael Warren and a federal prosecutor who'd flown in from Washington specifically for this conversation. Sheriff Karen Mitchell watched from the corner as Dalton prepared to reveal secrets he'd kept buried for nearly 2 decades. District Attorney Patricia Holmes laid out the terms clearly. In exchange for providing detailed, verifiable information about other victims and burial locations, Dalton would receive consecutive life sentences without parole instead of facing trial. He would never leave prison, but he would avoid the spectacle of a public trial. More importantly, he would give other families the answers they desperately needed. What made detectives willing to consider the agreement was the reality that Dalton's information might be the only way to solve cases that had gone cold years ago. The FBI had identified 7 women who'd vanished from carnivals between 2005 and 2010 under circumstances eerily similar to Jane's disappearance. Without Dalton's cooperation, those families might never know what happened. Dalton began talking shortly after noon, his voice flat and emotionless, as he described a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back to 2003. He'd learned quickly that the transient nature of carnival work and minimal background checks made it easy to move between states while using fake identities. He targeted women who were alone or isolated from crowds, offering help or directions before luring them to remote areas where he'd already prepared burial sites. The unsolved mystery of Jane and Olivia was only one chapter in a much darker story. Dalton admitted to killing 5 other women across Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida between 2005 and 2009. He provided specific details about burial locations, describing landmarks and GPS coordinates that FBI agents immediately began verifying. What made Dalton's confession particularly chilling was his explanation for why he'd targeted Jane specifically. He'd noticed her earlier in the evening, a young mother alone with an infant, clearly struggling financially. She represented vulnerability, someone unlikely to be missed immediately. He'd approached her near the games area, claiming to be security, and offering to help her find a quiet place to feed her baby away from crowds. Jane had trusted him because he wore a Carnival employee badge and seemed genuinely helpful. Dalton led her toward the service road, away from cameras and witnesses, claiming there was a break area behind the maintenance trailers. Once they were isolated among the pine trees, he'd attacked with the tire iron, striking Jane repeatedly while she desperately tried to shield Olivia. By late afternoon, FBI agents had begun excavating the burial sites Dalton described in other states. Sheriff Mitchell received updates throughout the evening as remains were discovered in Georgia and South Carolina, confirming that Dalton's information was accurate. On July 15, 2024, Christopher Dalton appeared in Robeson County Superior Court to formally enter his guilty plea. The courtroom was packed with family members of victims from multiple states, media representatives, and community members who'd followed Jane's case since 2008. Dalton showed no emotion as Judge Patricia Anderson accepted his plea and imposed consecutive life sentences totaling 300 years without possibility of parole. The memorial service for Jane and Olivia took place on August 10, 2024, at First Baptist Church in Lumberton, the same church where Patricia had attended services for over 50 years. More than 400 people filled the sanctuary, overflowing into the fellowship hall. The caskets containing Jane and Olivia's remains finally recovered and returned to family after decades buried in that tobacco barn, sat at the front surrounded by flowers. Kayla delivered the eulogy, her voice breaking as she described the friend who'd been taken from her that October evening in 2008. She talked about Jane's determination to build a better life for Olivia, despite the challenges of young motherhood, her dedication to nursing school, and her dreams of becoming someone who helped others heal. Sheriff Karen Mitchell attended the service, sitting in the back row and reflecting on the journey that had finally brought justice to Jane and Olivia. The cold case that had consumed so many resources had been solved not through brilliant detective work, but through the simple passage of time that weakened a tobacco barn roof, enough for a construction crew to discover what had been hidden beneath. What made this unsolved mystery's resolution particularly meaningful for Robeson County was how the community had never forgotten Jane and Olivia, despite 16 years passing without answers. Every October, when the Harvest Festival returned, people remembered. Local businesses had maintained the reward fund, even when hope faded. The persistence of an entire community had kept pressure on law enforcement to never close the case completely. By September 2024, FBI agents had confirmed that Christopher Dalton's confession had led to the recovery of remains from 5 other victims buried across the Southeast. Families in Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, and Florida finally had answers about daughters and sisters who'd vanished from carnivals between 2005 and 2009. Patricia's surviving family established the Jane and Olivia Memorial Scholarship at Robeson Community College, providing financial assistance to single mothers pursuing nursing degrees. The first scholarship was awarded in January 2025 to a young woman whose circumstances mirrored Jane's. Sheriff Mitchell retired in December 2024, her final major case solved and justice finally delivered. At her retirement ceremony, Mitchell spoke about the importance of never giving up on victims, never closing cases prematurely, and never losing faith that evidence would eventually emerge. The Robeson County Harvest Festival continued to operate each October, though organizers added a permanent memorial near the entrance gates, honoring Jane and Olivia. The plaque explained their story briefly, serving as a reminder that public safety requires vigilance. For the families who'd suffered through 16 years of uncertainty, the resolution brought mixed emotions. Justice had been achieved through Dalton's conviction, but that justice couldn't restore the years stolen. Patricia had died without knowing what happened. Jane never became the nurse she'd worked so hard to be. Olivia never experienced childhood. As 2025 began, Lumberton moved forward while carrying the memory of October 11, 2008. The story of Jane and Olivia became a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking behind ordinary moments, but it also became a story about a community's refusal to forget and law enforcement's dedication to pursuing justice no matter how long it took. The cold case that haunted Robeson County for 16 years was finally closed, but the lessons it taught would endure for generations.